Today we're going to be looking at a poem from the Power and Conflict cluster. We're going to be looking at Remains by Simon Armitage. Now, Remains is a war poem, but it focuses on a soldier who's telling the story of the time he had to shoot a bank looter. So it's a dramatic monologue, and the speaker is looking back and describing what happened and reflecting on the fact that the man he shot with two other soldiers may not have even been armed. So the speaker is traumatized. He can't stop thinking about the moment they all shot him, and that incident haunts him every night. So the main theme of the poem is the psychological effect of war: trauma, remorse, regret. Let's read it. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire. Three of a kind, all let him fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out, pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carried off in the back of a lorry. End of story. Except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol, I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. And the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. It's a good poem, this one. I think you're going to enjoy it. We're going to go through the poem, figure out what's happening line by line, and along the way, I'm going to point out around 3 of the juiciest quotations. And by juicy, I mean quotations that have lots of interesting language devices, words that you can zoom into, so that you feel confident if this poem comes up in your exam and you feel like you can write 3 detailed paragraphs about it. Let's start from the beginning. The title itself, Remains, could be seen as a pun, like wordplay, and it's used by Armitage to either mean remains of the human body or the emotional wound that remains with the individual soldier. I want to begin by analysing the very first line. The poem opens in media res. Very fancy. It means in the middle of the action. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank. Like we're already in the middle of the conversation. And this confuses the reader because they don't exactly know what's going on. And it mirrors the confusion of the soldier who isn't emotionally prepared for what his role requires him to do. So by starting in this way, straight in the middle, like at this other time, Armitage is implying that soldiers are launched into situations that they don't fully understand. Also, the opening of the poem reflects the chaos of the war and how unpredictable it is. I think it's really interesting that he says, on another occasion, which shows this wasn't the first time or an exceptional case. Violence like this is a reality that soldiers need to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Soldiers are expected to deal with repeated exposure to suffering and horror with no help. And then we can zoom in further. We can look at the verb tackle, which is associated with football, which shows maybe the young age and the naivety of the soldiers, whose terminology reveals that they were not ready for the magnitude and the level of violence required, and they didn't understand the severity of what they were getting themselves into. You know, he says, got sent out. We got sent out. He was following orders. So they're made to think that it's their duty, but it's not actually their choice. Looters is a really negative word. So it's like they've been brainwashed. They already have made up their minds that the victims are guilty. That's a looter, kill him. And then raiding a bank, that's not really what soldiers are meant to do. You're not meant to get someone who's raiding a bank, but then soldiers end up taking a range of responsibility beyond just fighting in wars. And then he goes on to say, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. It's not a funny quotation, it's a sad quotation. So I'm not smiling because it's funny. I'm just smiling because me and my sister always we actually use quotes from poems in our day-to-day language, and this is one of them that always comes up. If one of us says probably, the other one says possibly. Let's look at what he's just said. The looter runs up the road and the speaker says there was a chance he was innocent and not a threat. He says probably first, he was probably armed because that's what he wants to believe. So he's almost justifying what he did. And then he says, well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire. Let's analyze that quotation, copy it down for me. There are 3 soldiers, and they all shoot. The reader isn't given specifics of who is there, who did the shooting, who was killed. There's no mention of which war the soldier is in. There's repetition of somebody else, which is combined with polysyndeton, the repetition of the word and, which basically is and someone else and someone else. It shows that it's irrelevant who else was there because the speaker is taking the blame. It doesn't matter who was with me, I was there, I did that. And it also, I guess, shows the comradeship in war. He doesn't want to snake on his friends, so he's someone was there, can't tell you who it was. And that is reinforced structurally because myself comes first. Myself and someone else and someone else. He's taking ownership and responsibility for what they did. There's repetition of all in this quotation, which kind of shows the force of that group attack. It seems like an unfair power dynamic. All of us shot that one man. It makes the victim seem vulnerable. And then if I zoom into that word fire, he doesn't say shoot, he says open fire. It's religious imagery because fire is associated with hell and suffering. So they inflicted pain and punishment onto the looter. War puts ordinary people in that godlike position where they are able to take lives. He says, 3 of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear, next stanza, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So that's a hyperbolic metaphor. The bullet did not rip through his life. So it makes life seem fragile, like paper. You can just rip through it. And it's also chromomorphism. So war almost desensitizes you. He rips through him like a piece of paper. That's a human being described like an object. That's how easily he does it. And he says, I see, like he's watching it. It makes him seem passive, like he's in a state of shock. He can't believe what's just happened. Isn't it really interesting also that it's written in present tense? So it's like he's reliving it as he's describing it. And he says, I saw broad daylight on the other side. So he ripped through him so brutally that he can practically see through the other side. And I have a few different interpretations here. Firstly, he could be trying to reassure himself that over time, he's gonna feel better. So on the other side, there is daylight and that daylight symbolizes hope. Or maybe he's trying to convince himself that his victim will go to heaven. So on the other side, he's gonna be happier. He then describes the looter suffering and dying in pain. And he says, so we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. A dozen times. Such a violent death seems unnecessary and unjustified. Shoot him once, shoot him twice. Why are you shooting him a dozen times? And then he says sort of inside out, which is colloquial language. It's quite informal. I guess it's almost like he's putting on a facade and trying to pretend he hasn't been impacted. But then that immediately juxtaposes with the metaphor that follows, the image of agony. So there's a transition from colloquial language to really emotional language. And that's the realization of what he has done hits him. The word image also shows that he's trying to think of it like a photo rather than a real person. So he's trying to detach himself from what happened. And obviously there's enjambment here. The sentence isn't all on one line, it goes on to the next line. And that represents the way the bullets ripped through the body, maybe. So then he says, one of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. It's very gruesome imagery here. The verb tosses, if you just toss something, connotes like a lack of care. They're not respecting the body. It's being treated like an object again. That dead body has no value. And it shows how conflict, power and conflict, causes the devaluation of human life and a loss of sanctity. There is no dignity in the victim's death. Also, tossing is like a nonchalant action. They're so used to this because they have been exposed to so much death and so much violence that they're almost immune to it. Another dead piece of guts there, chuck it in. And then the body's taken away like it's an animal. It says he's carted off in the back of a lorry. And you'd think that the death of the looter would be the end of the story. The soldier keeps seeing the looter's blood. He is being haunted by his guilt. I want to analyze the quotation where it says, his blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol, I walk right over it week after week. So there's a pronoun being used, his. He doesn't even know his name. It's like depersonalized. I killed someone, I don't even know his name. It shows a lack of motive. What was the reason that you did this? And then blood's shadow is a metaphor because shadows aren't made of blood. And it illustrates how death stains a person's conscience and memory, just as it stains a street. And then like a shadow, shadows follow you around. They follow a person. Everywhere you go, your shadow is there. He is haunted by his crime. If I zoom into stays on the street, there's sibilance there, alliteration of S. It creates a really like an unsettling tone. It mirrors his sinister actions, or maybe it mimics the sound of his fear. Then week after week, there's some repetition. He is constantly reminded by what he has done, and there is no way to escape it. I could even go in further and I could look at the alliteration of W, like your bottom lip quivering. It shows this remorse and this regret. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. So he's at home, on leave, not at work anymore, thinking maybe he's gonna get some peace here. But that guilt comes home with him. Every time he blinks, he relives that moment. He's asleep and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. It's very sad. That phrase, probably armed, possibly not, is repeated again. He's fixed on this idea of the killing possibly being unjustified. He feels really guilty. He regrets killing the shooter. And he's suffering at home, trying drinks, drugs, but he just can't sleep. He cannot forget the looter, he cannot forget his guilt. And there's the Zura here. There's that pausing, which maybe mimics that interrupted sleep and that anxiety. He says, he's here in my head when I close my eyes. So the war zone is no longer real, but it is in his head. So there's this internal conflict due to his guilt. The speaker has clearly developed some sort of mental illness. He's suffering from PTSD. And it says, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. That's a mouthful. Or 6 feet under in desert sand. That bit might seem complicated, but it's not really. He's saying it would be easier to forget him if he was in some distant, far away, foreign land. But he's not. He's right here with me when I close my eyes. And the reference to desert sand locates the setting of the poem to the modern Middle Eastern wars, although Armitage doesn't explicitly specify that. And it says, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Firstly, there's a conjunction, but. So every time he tries to convince himself, doubts appear in his mind. And bloody is a pun, because it could have 2 meanings. The word could be describing the violent, gruesome nature of the death, bloody, or it could be the slang swear word, the bloody life. And the event has ruined his life and cursed him. Super interesting for those of you who do Macbeth, because it's one of my favourite plays ever. But this is also, the bloody hand is also an allusion to Lady Macbeth. You know, when she, in the end, before she kills herself, she has blood on her hands. So he feels doomed by the guilt of what he has done. Structurally, looking at this poem, it is written in 4-line stanzas, and our posh word for that is quatrains. He is trying to get his emotional state in some sort of order. He is trying to gain control, like the control of this structure of this poem. But the short stanza at the end shows he is unlikely to recover. The use of enjambment, the fact that it's like next line, next line, next line, next line, gives it the rhythm of a real speech, almost like a confession. So that's your analysis. I really enjoyed that. That's one of my favourite ones. I really enjoyed analysing this poem, but analysing language and structure isn't enough. If you are looking for a grade 7 to 9 in your exam, you also need to bring in something called context. And that means you need to talk about what was going on during the time the poem was written, or tell me something about the poet's life, and then therefore link that to the poet's intentions, the message they were trying to give the reader through this poem. Some interesting context points for Remains are: Simon Armitage was a British poet, and Remains was published in 2008 as part of his collection The Not Dead, which is a series of war poems based on the testimonies of ex-soldiers. Instead of detailing conflict, however, these poems explore the aftermath of war and the traumatic memories that ex-soldiers might struggle to cope with. Armitage wrote Remains following the war in Iraq. If you don't know about it, it probably is worth you researching and Googling it in detail before the exam so you get more of an idea. So he wrote this poem following a subsequent testimony from soldiers experiencing PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And in particular, this collection was based on a British soldier called Guardsman Tromans, I hope I pronounced that right, who served in Iraq in 2003. And then he was interviewed by the poet. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of his service. People were starting to oppose the war in Iraq during the time this poem was published. And at the time, the attack on Iraq was condemned as unnecessary and potentially due to America's greed for oil. So Armitage's poems helped to raise awareness of the effects of war. And there you have it, a full analysis of Remains by Simon Armitage. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do give it a like and don't forget to check out the rest of the videos in this series.